Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Hot Topics, where today we're going to be taking a look at the following. I don't know if it's a hot topic, but it's definitely an interesting topic. Polygamy in the Bible? Actually, this topic came as a question from some listener, and I thought, you know what? Let me answer that question as we teach on Hot Topics. So today we're going to talk about polygamy in the Bible. First question: is there polygamy in the Bible? Answer: yes. Second question: is polygamy from God? Answer: absolutely not. Let me show you. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2. And let's take a look at verses 24 and 25. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 describe creation. First of all, that God is the creator. And second of all, these chapters describe the perfection of creation. This is before sin came into the world through Adam and Eve. So here in Genesis 2, we see in verse 24 that marriage was God's idea, that God instituted this idea of marriage. And how did God define marriage? Verse 24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother, starting a new family, and be joined to his wife. Notice wife singular. They shall become one flesh, one in heart, mind, and soul, one physically, emotionally, spiritually. So we see here, way back at the beginning of creation, that God designed marriage and defined marriage as being between a man and a woman, one man, one woman, one lifetime. This is God's design for marriage. Notice God doesn't say a man can be joined to another man or a woman can be joined to another woman. Again, God doesn't say that a man can be joined to several women or a woman can be joined to several men. No. This is God's design for marriage and God's definition of marriage. So then the question is, why is there polygamy in the Bible? Answer: go to Genesis chapter 4. Here in Genesis 4, we start to see the horrific consequences of what happened in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. Sin came into the world. The consequences of sin: death, diseases, disobedience. I mean, you name it, right? Already in Genesis 4, we see the consequences of sin being manifest. Adam and Eve, they had two boys, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel. Well, we see some more happening. Verse 17, Cain had relations with his wife. She conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch, after the name of his son. You even see pride right here, right? Cain's thinking, I'm going to build an empire. Now to Enoch was born Irad. To Irad, he became the father of Mehujael. Mehujael became the father of Methushael. Methushael became the father, here it is, of Lamech. This is not the same Lamech who would become the father of Noah, end of chapter 5. No, this is a different Lamech. He's from the line of Cain. Let's learn a little bit about Lamech. Verse 19. Lamech took to himself how many wives? 2 wives. There's your first instance of polygamy in the Bible. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Marriage came from God, not from man. Who designed marriage and who defined marriage? God. Chapter 3, Adam and Eve disobey God. They sinned against God. The consequences of sin came. You have the fall. And here we are in Genesis 4. You already have one brother killing another brother, and now you have your first instance of polygamy. This guy, Lamech, was he obeying God? No. This guy, Lamech, was he looking to honor and worship God? No. How do we know that? Let's just keep reading about this guy. He took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, the other one was Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. As for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now watch this. Lamech said to his wives, Ada, Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Do you see the guy's arrogance? Give heed to my speech, for I've killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. But don't worry, verse 24. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Nothing's going to happen to me. You see what kind of person Lamech was? Coming through the line of Cain, Cain who killed his brother Abel. So right here, you have the first instance of polygamy in the Bible. It was not from God. It was not commanded by God. And we see the type of person who had inherited a sin nature because of the fall of Adam and Eve in chapter 3. And we see that sin nature being manifest in arrogance, in killing, and in polygamy. This was not God's design from the beginning. This is not how God had defined marriage at the beginning, right? And so the question is, all right, then why do we see all kinds of examples of polygamy in the Bible? You're right, we do. But I want you to understand something. All those polygamous relationships in the Bible, even by some of men, people who loved God, all those polygamous relationships, you'll notice something always came along with those relationships. You know what it is? Turmoil in the family. Let me give you an example, right? We see here with Lamech, right? First instance of polygamy. What kind of man was Lamech? Was he a God-fearer? No. He was an arrogant clown. And he was a polygamist. Well, go with me to Genesis 16. Let me show you a godly man who also, unfortunately, kind of decided to veer outside of God's design and definition of marriage. Genesis 16, starting in verse 1, we read, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children." God had promised Abram, way back in Genesis 12, that through Abram would come descendants and the eventual promised Messiah. God promised Abram descendants and land, promised land. But there was a problem, at least in Abram's eyes. He and his wife Sarai were old. Back in Genesis 12, when God first showed up with the promised Abram was 75, Sarai was 65. And she had been barren her entire life, no children. Well, fast forward now to Genesis 16. Abram, at this point, is in his mid-80s. Sarai, his wife, she's still barren, and she's in her mid-70s. So Sarai has an idea. Following the practice of the culture back then, which is never a good idea for God's people to do, right? Let's see what happened. Well, chapter 16, verse 1, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She's thinking the clock's ticking. Now, here's the deal. She had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her." Again, following the practices of the culture. Back then, if a woman had been barren, she, through one of her, female slaves, could actually have children, right? So the husband would get the female slave pregnant. She would bear a child. That child then would be the female master of that female slave. It would be hers, right? So in this instance, Sarai says, "Hey, I've got an Egyptian slave, Hagar. Abram, you go have relations with her, get her pregnant, and then the child is mine." End of verse 2. Abram, godly man, right? Through whom the line of Messiah would come. Abram, the father of faith, didn't exercise true faith to wait on the Lord's promise, right? End of verse 2, we're told Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Houston, we're about to have a problem. Verse 3. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, so he's in his mid-80s at this point, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Question. Genesis 2:24, God's design and definition of marriage. One man, how many women? One for one lifetime. We have disobedience here, right? Again, we see the consequence of sin. Not just in an evil man like Lamech, we saw in Genesis 4, the first polygamist. We see it happening here through two godly people, Abram and Sarai. Verse 4, Abram went into Hagar, she conceived, and look what happened. Turmoil. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Now we have jealous rivalry happening between Sarai and her female slave, Hagar. Remember I said a little bit earlier? Yeah, we see examples of polygamy in the Bible. Wasn't God's design, nor God's definition of marriage. Polygamy, consequence of sin. Not part of God's plan. And even godly people like Abram and Sarai fell prey to what the culture was doing back then. And the result? Well, you have the birth of a baby, but now you've got turmoil in Abram's household between his true wife, Sarai, and the one he went in and slept with and took as his wife, Hagar. Sarai, verse 5, said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight." Turmoil. "May the Lord," Sarai said to Abram, "judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her, Hagar, harshly, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to shore. He said, "Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from? Where are you going?" And she said, "I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return back to your mistress, submit to her authority." Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your descendants, so this baby you just gave birth to, that you and this baby, you've run away from Sarai and Abram, go back to her. Okay? Don't worry. There's a promise here from the angel of the Lord. Yahweh, Christ in his pre-incarnate state. "I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count." And oh, by the way, who are going to be these descendants? Answer, verse 11. The angel of the Lord said to her further, "Behold, you're with child, and you're going to bear a son." A little earlier I said she had already given birth. She hadn't. She was still pregnant. She was about to give birth. "Behold, you're with child. You're going to bear a son. And you're going to call his name what? Ishmael." Huh. Ishmael, through Abraham, Ishmael, the Arabs. "Behold, you're with child, you're going to bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction." He's going to be a wild donkey of a man. "His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers." Think about what's happening in the Middle East now. Think about what's been happening in the Middle East since this. Talk about turmoil that not only existed immediately in Abram's house, but think about how that turmoil has come down through Abraham's descendants through Ishmael, the Arabs, and Abraham's descendants through Isaac, the Israelites. Go to Genesis 21. Yeah, polygamy didn't work so well for Abram, did it? And boy, did Sarai regret her suggestion to Abram. So now you've got Hagar with her son Ishmael. He's now growing. He's about a teenager as we get to Genesis 21. But remember, God had promised Abraham that he would give Abraham and Sarai a promised son. Well, when Abram was almost right around at 100 and Sarai was 90, guess what happened? Chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, right? 25 years earlier. And the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken. We may think God's promises are late. They never are. That which God promises, God always fulfills in the perfect way, at the perfect time, and he doesn't need our help. Verse 3, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarai bore to him, Isaac, the promised son. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me, not at me, but with me, with joy. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I've borne a son in his old age. Beautiful, right? Not quite. Don't forget, back in Genesis 16, when both Abram and Sarah tried to, quote, help, unquote, God fulfill the promise. Honey, would you go sleep with my female slave Hagar? Sure, why not? Yeah, so when you get her pregnant, then the child is mine. Sure. Great plan, huh? Not quite. What happened when she was pregnant? Hagar. She despised Sarah. No, the baby's going to be mine. Turmoil in the household. Well, praise God. About 15 years later, Abram's 100, Sarai's 90, the promised son, Isaac. Watch what happens. Verse 8, the child grew, Isaac, and was weaned, so he's a couple years old. And Abram, according to custom back then, made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Verse 9. Guess who shows up to the party? Now Sarah saw that the son of Hagar the Egyptian, what was his name? Ishmael, who's now a teenager at this point. He comes to his brother Isaac's little party. Sarah saw Ishmael show up. Okay. Was he showing respect? No. He was mocking the boy. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore, she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Do you see the turmoil that continued in that home? Obviously, verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. I mean, he loved Ishmael. But Isaac was the promised one. That's why, verse 12, God said to Abraham, don't be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendant shall be named. The Messiah would come through the line of Isaac. Verse 13, but God promised Abram, and the son of the maid, Ishmael, I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant, the Arabs. Abraham, father of faith. It is through Isaac you have the Israelites and Christians. It is through Abraham and Ishmael you have the Arabs. Let's go back to Genesis 16. Way back when Ishmael was in his mommy's womb. Remember, she had run away from Sarai because there was going to be a major, major problem in that house. Remember verse 11 of chapter 16, the angel of the Lord showed up to her and said, behold, you were a child. You'll bear a son. You'll call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone. Fast forward about 13 or so years later, maybe 15 years later, Isaac had been born. He's weaned. They're now going to have a party for him. Look how Ishmael mocked him. You even now have dissension and turmoil amongst the brothers. Well, isn't that what God said would happen? His hand, Ishmael and his descendants, will be against everyone. And everyone's hand will be against him. Has that not been happening throughout history all the way up till today? And he'll live to the east of his brothers. Yeah, there's polygamy in the Bible. It was never part of God's design, nor definition of marriage, not part of God's plan. Polygamy is the result of sin. Sin, by the way, that came into the world through Adam and Eve. Right? And although we see examples of polygamy in the Bible, we also see turmoil always attached to those polygamous relationships. And ultimately, you know who's to blame for this? You think about what's happening in the Middle East. Think of all the turmoil there that really came about as a result of a polygamous relationship. Well, we know who to blame. Adam. Because he disobeyed God way back in Genesis 3. And what we saw in Genesis 4, Cain killing his brother Abel, Lamech, first polygamist, boasting, bragging, killing. Those are examples of sin in the world. Even two godly people, Abraham and Sarai, they fell prey to that. How'd that work out for them? And how has that worked out throughout history all the way up to now? Just do a study in the Bible on all the polygamous relationships. You can take a look at Jacob and his wives. Think of wait till you read about the turmoil there. Think of David and all his wives. David, a man after God's own heart. Think of all the turmoil there. How about Solomon? No, God's definition of marriage, God's design of marriage is the only way. One man, one woman, one lifetime. And oh, by the way, you can just go on certain streaming services and watch documentaries about modern day cults. Many of those cults involved in polygamy. And you see these documentaries of people who have been brainwashed in those cults. Women who had been, quote, married, unquote, to the leader of the cult, along with probably 100 other women. Wait till you hear their sad stories. Praise God, they've been rescued out of those cults, but the damage that's been done to them psychologically is brutal. Polygamy, God doesn't bless polygamy because polygamy is not God's design for marriage. God says marriage is between one woman, one man, for one lifetime. And what God brings together, let no one or nothing tear apart. Amen.